interrupting the show for a special report.
Because now it is time for Bag Lab.
All right, so for tonight's Bag Lab, I had an email and somehow I was not able to locate the email before the show, but I definitely had it in my binder that I keep with all of my Bag Lab questions. But someone wanted to know how to make a cargo or a pleated pocket for a bag. So I pre-recorded that earlier today, a couple hours before the show. So let me show you what I mean by the pleated pocket before we begin. But here's my finished pleated pocket. It's waiting for a flap to go up on top, and that will be a future Bag Lab discussion. And there's a couple options that I give in this particular demonstration. One for a pleated pocket that sort of sits on the outside of the bag, and then I have another version where the pleated pocket is actually kind of sewn into the seam allowance, the sides and the bottom. So enjoy. Before we begin, you'll need to print out the pattern piece for the cargo pocket, and it's just one page. You'll notice there's a 1-inch square and a 4-centimeter square near the top. You'll want to take your ruler and measure either square to make sure that it measures either exactly 1 inch or exactly 4 centimeters. It shouldn't be slightly larger or slightly smaller, it should be exact. So go ahead and take out your scissors and cut to the outside of the thicker black line. And you actually might want to print out a second copy of this page because you'll notice the dashed lines. We'll be using the dashed lines to cut out from the interfacing, so sometimes it's helpful to have two copies so you can leave one intact and you can cut the second one along the dashed lines. And we'll be leaving these two vertical lines alone for now. Those are pressing lines, which we'll be transferring to the fabric in just a second. So you'll use this pattern piece to cut out your pieces from fabric and interfacing. And then I've got my fabrics here and I attached my interfacing to the exterior. For me, the exterior is the darker fabric and the lining fabric is the lighter fabric, and I went ahead and attached the interfacings centered. I also went ahead and cut out, because I will be inserting a magnetic snap into this, because later on I'll be demonstrating how to add a flap, and that flap will have the other half of the magnetic snap. So while I'm assembling, I'll show you how to install the magnetic snap, and if you won't have a flap, you can go ahead and omit it, but I do really like the look of the cargo pocket with the flap. So I went ahead and cut out a piece of either you can use Peltex or Decovil Heavy. This is Decovil Heavy, and I just cut it to a 1.5 inch square, and this is to reinforce the magnetic snap on the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use my pattern piece. Actually, I have one that I prepared earlier, and I just folded at both of the vertical lines. There's a few different ways you can transfer these vertical markings to your fabric. I'm going to transfer it on the right side and on the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm going to use some chalk. You can use a friction pen also. I usually recommend using the friction pen on the wrong side of the fabric. I'll use the friction pen for this video just so you can see clearly where I'm marking. So you can either have the pattern piece on top of the fabric and fold everything together along those lines. You can fold the paper back so you can transfer the lines. There's a few different ways you can do it. I'm going to go ahead and just mark, since I folded this already, I can sort of see the crease on my fabric. So I'm just going to go ahead and at the very top make a really small marking. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other half as well. And then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm just going to go ahead and connect the two markings and just draw a straight line. You should have 4 lines, and I'm also going to transfer these lines to the wrong side of the fabric, and also for my second piece I'm going to do the same thing. So both pieces should be marked on the right side and the wrong side of the fabric. Now I'm going to take out my exterior piece, and since I'm installing a magnetic snap, I went ahead and made a marking where I wanted the magnetic snap to go. This is the male portion of the magnetic snap, and I decided I wanted it to be centered, obviously, but I decided I wanted it to be down 1.5 inches from the top edge. This may vary depending on where you'll be placing the pocket and your finished flap, but mine's 1.5 inches down. So I'm going to go ahead and use my rivet press and make a hole where I made the marking, as well as in that little 1.5 inch square of interfacing. And for the 1.5 inch square, I'm just going to make a hole approximately centered. Okay, so you'll be installing the male portion of the magnetic snap using the manufacturer instructions. I like using the magnetic snaps installed on my rivet press. If you're interested in that, I do have a separate video showing how to install magnetic snaps on the rivet press. They have sort of a backing similar to a large rivet. So I'm going to go ahead and slip that through the right side of the fabric, and then on the back I'm going to go ahead and place that 1.5 inch square and then the cap of my magnetic snap. And if you're using a traditional magnetic snap with the prongs, you'll do the same thing and then just open the prongs outward. So I'm going to go ahead and swap out my die on my rivet press for the snap. Okay, so if you are installing the snap, once you've got the snap installed, then it's time to press the pleats. So we're going to be pressing the exterior and the lining pleats in opposing directions. So for the exterior, I'm going to start with the 2 vertical lines closest to the magnetic snap, and I'm going to press those toward the wrong side. And then the second ones are going to be pressed toward the front. So you can do, I recommend doing 1/2 at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and flip. And again, here's the first line. I'm going to press that so that the fabrics are wrong sides together. And then for the second line, which is why we marked on both sides, I'm going to go ahead and press that so that those 2 pieces are right sides together. And then same thing on the other half. Okay, so this is what it will look like from the right side. I'm going to go ahead and use some Wonder Clips just to hold the pleats in place. We'll be stitching those pleats down in just a second. Okay, so now let's pull out the lining piece, and we're going to press that opposite of what we just did. So instead of pressing the first line wrong sides together, we're going to be pressing it so that the fabrics are right sides together. Okay, again, I'm going to use some Wonder Clips to hold the pleats in place. And then again, let me pull out the exterior just so you can see the difference. So the exterior, as you can see, I can put my fingers in here. The pleat looks like this, and this is the lining, and this is what the lining pleats look like. So I'm going to take both of these over to the sewing machine and separately just stitch just the top edge about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, just the center section to hold the pleats down, and I'll do the same thing for the lining fabric. And you'll do the same thing for that lining piece. Now go ahead and place these right sides together and pin in place. We're going to be sewing the entire outer edge using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, except we need to leave an opening centered along the top edge. And sometimes when I'm sewing, I just like to leave myself a little reminder where that opening will be. So as long as you sew at least 1 inch in, that should be enough space to give for leaving that opening. Okay, let's take this over to the sewing machine, and again, we're sewing using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now I'm going to clip the corners, which just means cutting on a diagonal without cutting into your stitches. And then where there's these 2 curves at the bottom, I'm just going to cut small little V's. Again, being careful not to cut into the stitches. You can use pinking shears here if you prefer. Okay, and then I'm going to turn the pocket right side out. Okay, I'm going to use my turning tool. This is the precision turning tool, and I'm just going to gently push out those 2 top corners. And then I'm just kind of dragging it around the bottom to push the corner out as well. So I'm going to give the pocket a press, and I'm also going to press this opening along the top toward the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. So if you're more comfortable, you can measure it first. I usually just sort of eyeball it and then bring the fabrics so that they meet. So I'm going to put some Wonder Clips on the opening, and I'm going to take this back over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch just the opening using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3 millimeters for this top stitching. Now your pocket is essentially finished, so all that's left is to decide where on your bag that you'd like to place it. For this example, I'm just going to use the free Baker Street bag. This is the front of the bag. And you'll want to make sure, one, if you intend for the pocket to be centered, you'll want to make sure it's centered. You want to leave room in the seam allowance so when you're sewing the bag together, this is not too close to either the bottom or top edge. And then I plan to add a flap later on, so I also need to make sure that I have room left for the flap. So this seems like a good place to put it. So I'm just going to go ahead and you can either use traditional pins, or if you like using magnetic pins, you can use those to hold the pocket in place. And then I'm going to sew the sides and the bottom using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. When you get to the 2 top corners, make sure you backstitch very well. I also wanted to give another option for if you didn't want just sort of the pocket on the body of the bag, perhaps you wanted to incorporate the pocket into the seam, perhaps the bottom seam. So I went ahead and sewed another sample with the same piece from the Baker Street bag, except this time I made the pocket the entire length of the bag, and the only difference when assembling the pocket is you're only sewing the top edge when you go ahead and sew the exterior to the lining. So I sewed the top edge, again using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I used the side and bottom edges, I left those raw, assuming they would be sewn into the sides and the bottom seam of the bag. So the nice thing about this paper pattern piece is that you can adapt it to several different sizes or types of bags. So you can either print it at a certain percentage, perhaps you needed a bigger pocket, or you can lengthen the piece. So what I did here for this piece that was left raw on the sides and the bottom is on my fabric, I went ahead and folded it in half. I placed the pattern piece on the fold, and then I went ahead and measured how much longer I needed it to be to fit on this fabric panel from the Baker Street bag. So what I did was, after printing my pattern piece, I just folded it along those 2 folds because that's how big this piece will be once it's finished. Okay, so once the pleats are pleated, this is the width of the piece times 2 because it's placed on the fold. And so what I did was I just measured how much longer I needed it to be to cover this piece. So when I measured it, it needed to be 3.5 inches, which is what I added to this piece when I cut out my fabric. And I folded it the same as the pattern piece because I wanted the pleat to finish off at the same size. This pleat is 2 inches wide. So you don't need to do anything to the cut on the place on the fold edge. All I did was to lengthen it, I added to this edge. So you can either add it to this edge and extend the curved piece, or I just left my side pieces straight because I kind of wanted it to be longer so that I could trim it to fit. So as you can see, I sewed it to the body of the Baker Street bag, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and trim it to match this main panel piece from the Baker Street bag, or whatever bag that you're adding it to. Okay, so this is what it looks like after it's attached. Again, I'll be adding a flap. Watch out for a video. I'm going to come up with a video with different styles of flaps, and you can incorporate the flap pattern pieces from that video. I'll update the links in the description, so when that video comes out, you can have both the cargo pocket video and the flap video in the same place. So again, it's a pretty adaptable pattern piece, whether you're completely finishing your pocket or you're adding it into the body of the bag so that it will be sewn into the seam while you construct the finished bag. And again, the link for this pattern piece is in the description. I wanted to mention one thing about that magnetic snap. Be sure when you're ironing the pleats not to touch the iron to the metal of the magnetic snap. And if you kind of feel a little bit worried about it, you can always iron your pleats first, and then, well, before ironing your pleats, mark where that magnetic snap is going to go, then iron the pleats, and then you can lastly install the magnetic snap if you feel more comfortable with that. And I think Danny said there might have been a question or two while that demonstration was going. Kim wanted to know, Sarah, do you have this pattern online? Yes, for that paper pattern piece for the cargo pocket, I've linked to that in the description, and I've also linked to the Baker Street bag just in case you're interested in that one. Those are both free. The Baker Street bag is also a free pattern and a free video. Shannon says, interesting, I've been making these wrong as I make each piece the exact same instead of having the inside pleat different. You can do both. So if you had the lining piece without the pleats on the inside, if the lining was just sort of the same size as the finished, like your lining piece was the same size as the finished width of the pleated exterior, it would just be sort of a faux cargo pocket because it wouldn't have that extra. The pleat kind of makes it so that it can expand a bit more. So either one's fine. You'll still have on the exterior the look of the cargo pocket. So whatever you're more comfortable with. If you're not planning on putting a lot of stuff inside, you can go ahead and just cut your lining piece the same size as your exterior after you've ironed the pleats.